Hi, everyone. My name is Jasmine. I work with Physicians for Social Responsibility, and thank you all for joining us for Invisible Devastation, the Global Legacy of Uranium. We have some wonderful panelists today. Unfortunately, one wasn't able to make it, but I think it's still going to be a great discussion. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules. Please be respectful in the Q&A section. My apologies, the chat is actually disabled for this webinar, but you can put any comments or questions you have in the Q&A function, and we'll be sure to share those throughout the discussion. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Tova to give some brief introductions.
Thank you, Jasmine. Welcome to Invisible Devastation, the Global Legacy of Uranium. When Americans think of nuclear weapons, probably these days, the first thing that comes to mind right off the tip of their zeitgeist is Oppenheimer. And for some of the people in the room, surely the Ukraine war. But I'd argue this film was damaging. And I'd like not to spend too much time dissecting it, other than to say it was the story of a group of mostly white men with a scene incredibly triumphant that their weapon of mass destruction had detonated, culminating in the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but only focusing a fraction of the time on Oppenheimer's guilt for what he had done. There was nothing on the downwinders, nothing at all. What was more notable was a New York Times article that followed. Trinity nuclear test fallout reached 46 states, Canada, and Mexico, study finds. A later article expanded on this finding. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, partially compensates some victims in several states, but not nearly enough. It compensates them to the tune of thousands of dollars. But I want you all here to note that if it were a non-governmental organization that caused this level of contamination and heightened incidence of cancers, the payout would have been over $1 million per person. So today you'll hear from Dr. Shampa Biswas, Alicia Inez Guzman, Macoma Lekalakala, and Mitchie Takeuchi, telling 4 different narratives on how the legacy of nuclear weapons is not a faceless textbook history. The story of nuclear weapons is not a white man's triumph or a story of Northern countries' Cold Wars. It was and continues to be a story of people living in communities around the world that have been devastated by the production and use of nuclear weapons. That said, we can't keep reframing and retelling this story, ignoring the effects uranium mining has in South Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Niger, and elsewhere. Because the machinery that produces our warheads is in part composed of people that will never press the button or hold the briefcase. They live in countries that do not even have their own nuclear weapons. It is an incredible injustice that for the hegemony and dominance of the US on the world stage, in the almighty name of deterrence, people must suffer in countries miles and miles away, especially considering that we have thousands upon thousands more nuclear weapons than needed to cause nuclear winter and nuclear famine, the destruction of our entire species at least 10 times over. Likewise, we can't just dismiss the Marshall Islands, the downwinders of Trinity, or the Hunters Points of this world. We planned this event to force a recentering of the narrative where it rightfully belongs, on those who have and continue to suffer. The very manufacturing of nuclear weapons is causing human suffering on an ongoing basis. Their previous testing has ongoing effects in the communities that were unwittingly affected. Nuclear weapons do not need to have been used in a war to cause trauma and disease. And when they were used in a war, or could be in the future, the effects were catastrophic and multi-generational. I will tell you, as a psychiatrist and a geneticist, that trauma is inherited in many ways, not only in our stories, in the environment around us that is destroyed, but even through epigenetic changes carried from grandparent to grandchild. And as far as war goes, the genocidal use of a nuclear explosion on civilians is and continues to be, and can be in the future, traumatic. This is not Oppenheimer's bomb. It is all of our bomb. It is our taxpayer dollars, those of us in the room who are United States citizens, At the very least, billions each year stolen from an investment in life towards an investment in pain, disease, and death. I say this because the goal should be a complete dismantling of our nuclear weapons infrastructure, complete and total nuclear abolition in line with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I want to thank all of our panelists that have taken time out of their busy schedules to be with us today. I want to thank Jasmine so much. And with that, I will pass the mic to Jasmine.
Great. Thank you so much, Tova. So we'll begin with remarks from each of the speakers. I'll introduce each speaker and let them talk, and then we will go right into a Q&A discussion. So to begin, we have Shampa Biswas. Shampa is an international relations theorist specializing on race, colonialism, and nuclear politics. She's the author of Nuclear Desire, Power and the Post-Colonial Order, and numerous articles on the intersections of race and colonialism with nuclear arms control, nonproliferation, and disarmament. She is a recent recipient of a Plowshares grant focused on decolonizing the nuclear studies curriculum. She is currently working on a project on nuclear memorialization and the global story of Fat Man, which is the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. And with that, I turn it over to you, Shampa.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to Jasmine for inviting me to this forum. I want to preface my comments by saying, I think I'm the only academic among the panelists. And sometimes as an academic, I think I'm doing good work, but I think that work sort of pales in comparison to the kind of work, the advocacy and activism work that my co-panelists are doing in the world, sometimes with frontline communities. So I feel very honored to be part of this panel. So thank you. I am going to start also where Tova started, with the Oppenheimer film. And I'm going to echo some of what she said, which I thought was very helpful. So I'm guessing most people here have seen the film. I don't think I'm going to give any plot spoilers here. That the Oppenheimer film has been critiqued for its problematic representations of women, especially the figures of Kitty Oppenheimer and Jean Tatlock, but also its underrepresentation of both women and people of color. And I think that's very, very apparent, right? There was a recent, I think, Washington Post article that said that there were 640 women which were employed at Los Alamos, which was about 11% of the workforce, half of whom were scientists. And I think the film shows one female scientist, Lily Hornig, and she has, I think, 3 really fleeting scenes. What it also doesn't show are the workers at Los Alamos, the maids, janitors, babysitters, construction workers. And if it did that, it would show that there were a lot more people of color. Most of these workers were drawn from the Hispano and Native communities in the Los Alamos area. So I think it's absolutely the case that the film underrepresents both women and people of color. But I think what the movie does effectively, in actually a visually stunning way, is show how white male dominated the nuclear world of the upper echelons of the nuclear world are, the world of making and using the bomb, the decisions on using the bomb, right? The scientists and the soldiers, the policy-making world is very much dominated by white male, by white men. And it really makes you ask, where are the women? Where are the POC? When I'm going to teach that movie, that's what I'm going to get my students to ask. That is not an inaccurate representation, right? The making of the bomb, the policy making on the bomb was and continues to be a predominantly white male dominated world still, right? If you flip that perspective, if you looked at the world, at the nuclear world from a victim or impacted community perspective, you see a nuclear world that is populated with people of color and women, right? They're everywhere. You really need to flip that perspective, not look at it from the perspective of bomb making or policy making. The impacts are disproportionately experienced by women. I think there's an allusion to reproductive health in from plutonium exposure in the film, but that's about it. But if you took a victim or impacted community perspective, you see how many people of color and how many women are part of the nuclear world. So I really want to commend PSR for constituting a panel that looks like this one, right? And I think especially Jasmine for creating this panel. Even now, neither at academic conferences nor at policymaking conferences do you see panels that look like this. So I think Tova already said this, a victim or impacted community perspective really forces us to look at the entire production chain of nuclear weapons, not just their making, not just their targeting and use. And that's all the way starting with uranium mining to milling, plutonium processing, weapons production, testing, of course, and the storage of nuclear waste, all of which disproportionately has occurred on colonized and/or indigenous lands. And we really need to ask what kinds of racialized assumptions about brown and Black people and their lands make it possible to mine on their lands, test on their lands, store waste in or near their lands, right? So what kind of racialized assumptions about certain kinds of people make it possible to do that, but also what kinds of racialized assumptions help us forget that part of the nuclear world, right? So I think that kind of racialization is also very much evident on the kinds of stories we remember and tell about the bomb. And this is, I think, what Tova was referring to in talking about the Oppenheimer film. Jasmine already alluded to this. I have been working for the last few years on trying to understand how Fat Man, the bomb that was dropped in Nagasaki, is remembered at different nodes of its production chain. So what are the stories we tell about that bomb at the different nodes of its production chain? And I've been looking at 4 sites primarily. That bomb, it begins with, the story of that bomb begins with mining that occurred in Shinkolobwe in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's where the uranium was mined. That uranium was processed into plutonium at Hanford, which is not very far from where I live currently. That weapon was tested in Trinity, which is what we see mostly in the Oppenheimer film. And then, of course, it was dropped in Nagasaki, where it killed a lot of people, right? Of those 4 sites, 3 of those sites have museums. Hanford and Trinity both have museums. Trinity is open twice a year to tourists. You have to really plan to get there, but there is a commemoration that occurs at that site. Both those museums tell a story of scientific ingenuity, patriotism, the making of the bomb, and the winning of World War II through technological mastery. It's very much the kind of story that the Oppenheimer film tells in one sense, in the way that Tova talked about it. Nagasaki has a pretty elaborate museum. It's a victim-centered narrative that you get at that site. It's a very moving narrative. But the site in Shinkolobwe, where the uranium was mined, has nothing that helps us remember that it played such a massive role in the making of that bomb, right? So mining at Shinkolobwe happened under a very brutal colonial regime, during Belgian colonial rule. That was a site that attracted a lot of attention during the Cold War from the US, from France, from the UK. So for a lot of time, there was a long period when that site was really very much at the center of nuclear policymakers' thinking, right? But since that site has been closed, it's basically a wasteland. There is no memorial, there is no commemoration. I think in a recent piece, I said, for the darkest people in the nuclear production chain of Fat Man, there is neither commemoration nor reparation. We've forgotten that story, right? And I want to ask, what does that mean? What does that kind of lack of remembrance mean for our possibility to continue doing certain things? So there have been stories recently about cobalt mining and coltan mining in Congo, which helps sustain our more sustainable, environmentally sustainable lives, right? The cobalt mining for electric vehicles. And and the mining conditions there are absolutely brutal, right? So I want us to sort of ask, what does the fact that we don't remember the conditions of mining that went into the making of the nuclear bomb make it still possible? What does that make possible for the continuing exploitation that happens in those areas that have been racialized? And I think Shinkolobwe should be a World Heritage Site, like some of the other nuclear sites are. But I think there's something about the lack of attention to that site that should teach us about what we are able to remember and what we are not. I'm going to end there.
Thank you so much, Shampa. Those were just really remarkable statements. And I'm so glad that you brought up Shinkolobwe, because you're right, that is a story that is not talked about nearly enough, and is actually the story that really got me into this work and propelled me towards working and fighting for nuclear abolition. So up next, we will have Alicia Inez Guzman speak. Alicia was raised in the northern New Mexico village of Truchas and has written about histories of place, identity, and land use in New Mexico. She brings this knowledge to her current role covering the nuclear industry as an investigative reporter for Searchlight, New Mexico, where she focuses on the impact of nuclear weapons expansion at the Los Alamos National Laboratory on local Hispanic and Indigenous communities. Alicia holds a PhD in Visual and Cultural Studies from the University of Rochester in New York. And with that, I turn it over to you, Alicia.
Good morning, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. And I just want to echo what Shampa said. You know, it's really excellent to be among women of color on a panel like this, really speaking about the history and the current situation we're in with nuclear weapons and our future. To give a little bit of background, I just wanted to begin by saying where I am. So I am in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I am on indigenous land, otherwise known as Ogapoge, indigenous ancestral land to Tewa relatives here in northern New Mexico. And it's very close to where I grew up, where I was born and raised, in the village of Truchas. And Truchas, as it happens to be, is 30 miles east as the crow flies from Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so I have always lived in the shadow of the weapons complex. And that has really informed my thinking and coming to critical awareness about where northern New Mexico is and New Mexico is in the global weapons complex at large. Just a few comments about Los Alamos. You know, when you grow up so near to a weapons complex like Los Alamos National Laboratory, which is where the first atomic bomb was made, at first it's kind of cognitive dissonance. You know, for me, I've always described it as a low-level hum, and it really didn't come to my awareness until I left this state and started really thinking critically about the role of Los Alamos National Laboratory in my backyard, because essentially it has employed many people of color from northern New Mexico in the last 3 or 4 generations. And so a lot of communities in northern New Mexico feel very beholden to Los Alamos National Laboratory, despite the fact that if you've had a family member work at Los Alamos National Laboratory, you've probably very likely had a family member who has died in some ways in relation to their work at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And that is, you know, something that folks here talk about around kitchen tables, is, you know, the economic benefits, but also the harm of living in a place like northern New Mexico. Of course, Los Alamos National Laboratory has impacted this entire state and the nation and the globe. I have a hyper-local perspective, and I like to use that in my writing to really think about, you know, a worm's eye perspective of what that looks like here. And just to add a little tiny bit more context to that, many of my family members have worked in the weapons complex. And so that started with my grandfather, who was a security guard for the Atomic Energy Commission. And it proceeded through the generations. I've had uncles, aunts, and I myself have worked for Los Alamos National Laboratory as an intern through programs that were established between local high schools and colleges and the laboratory. And so that has given me a really singular perspective, I think, in writing about Los Alamos. When I worked there myself, I worked in an explosives division for a summer. And later I worked for the Bradbury Science Museum, which has replicas of Fat Man and Little Boy. And my work there involved writing exhibition text about J. Robert Oppenheimer, Hans Bethe, Richard Feynman, those early architects, Whitman of the atomic bomb. And so during that time, I wasn't writing the history of my people. I was writing the history of these white men who were in policymaking and scientific decision-making roles. And so now, as I move forward as a journalist with an academic background, my goal is to tell all of the stories and to look at the history of our indigenous relatives here in New Mexico, of our Hispanic relatives here in New Mexico, and to look at that a little bit more comprehensively in tandem with the weapons complex on the whole. And so, I think it's really important, again, to echo previous comments about the film Oppenheimer. When I watched it, every landscape I saw was familiar to me, and it was painful because what I saw were landscapes completely emptied of presence. And that showed to me a kind of imagination about the Southwest. And what that imagination projects onto us is that we are a sparsely populated, pristine landscape. And really the fact of the matter is that the weapons complex has completely transformed this place in ways that we're still figuring out. It's charted an entirely new future for us. And I think that, again, we're still trying to figure out what that future looks for, our people. And so I'll leave it at that. And I look forward to a really excellent conversation and series of questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Alicia, for sharing your story and for also uplifting the stories of others who have often been ignored or silenced for the sake of more sanitized and milquetoast, shall I say, narratives from those in power. I want to move to our next speaker, Macoma Lekalakala. Ms. Macoma Lekalakala is the director of Earthlife Africa, which is an activist environmental justice organization. She has been active in social movements tackling issues from gender and women's rights issues, economic and environmental justice issues. In recent years, Makoma has focused on targeting environmental corruption. Her commitment to climate justice in South Africa has led civil society to win the first South African climate change legal case against the government and the reversal of the nuclear deal by the South African and the Russian government, of which she received the Goldman Environmental Prize for Africa in 2018, and the SAB Environmentalist of the Year Award in 2018, amongst other accolades. Mrs. Lekalakala has her roots as a liberation fighter and is a strong campaigner for a just and fair society. She is also a commissioner in the Presidential Climate Commission, a body tasked in advising the South African president on a process of a just transition to a low-carbon economic development. And with that, I turn it over to you, Makoma.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the introductions. I'm currently in Johannesburg, and I live in Soweto, which is in the outskirts of Johannesburg. It's windy during the day, and sometimes at night it's also very windy. And what happens with the wind is that there's dust that comes out of the gold mining tailings that are not even covered. And this has been an experience for a number of years for people living around Johannesburg, particularly the people that are living around an area called Riverlea. Their houses are built on top of this tailings. And I'm just wondering why the houses were built on top of the mine tailings. But this is part of the legacy of apartheid. This is part of the racial apartheid that we experienced here in South Africa, that people's, particularly working class lives, Black people's lives, don't matter, in a sense that they can be put anywhere. And the areas that we are in Soweto, Riverlea, and the other surrounding areas, these were the areas where it was like a pool of laborers where companies could come and get people and give them a pittance wage, and they paid most of them with their lives. But what we are experiencing in Johannesburg is that the health of the people that are living around this mine tailings are affected due to the exposure of the tailings radiological properties. And that's why in these areas, you have a number of people that have an extremely high number of people that have a variety of cancers. And the cancers that are there, the city of Johannesburg, the health department would really not even report about how many people have this kind of problems. They would always bring up lifestyles of people, that people smoke, people get drunk, or people are always drunk, but not wanting to pinpoint at the radioactive or radiological properties that are airborne, that are already in the air, and that people are breathing continuously. So the experience that people have around Johannesburg, this is the kind of experience that people have in other provinces, like cities, like Stilfontein, Hartbeespoort. This is where the gold mining tailings are. And this is not something that even the National Nuclear Regulator is taking up seriously. But we see also a new kind of rush into getting uranium. These mine tailings are being mined for new uranium. And most of the companies that are involved, it's South African companies, it's Russian companies, it's Chinese companies. And these companies from these 3 countries, already you find them in other 9 countries, including South Africa in the continent. You'd find them in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Gabon, in Madagascar, in Niger, in Namibia. And it's so heartening that in all the areas where uranium mining is taking place, there's disregard for people's health, there's disregard for people's health, there's disregard for nature. And what's much more appalling is that our governments are actually allowing this to happen, and without taking proper regulatory measures. We do have regulations, but they are not implemented. And when people start raising up and talking about the injustices or complaining about the health aspect or where they are, not enough work is being done. Every time we were told about research that is taking place, and this has created a despondency on the people, on the government to be able to do this. But because of the material conditions that people live under, people are forced to be living in these particular areas. If you know the story of, I'm very glad that one of the speakers mentioned the story of Shinkolope in the DRC, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I agree with the speaker that this should be a site which should remind people of the horrors of nuclear armaments, the horrors of nuclear energy. This is where people should be reminded, but that it's not even being done. And in Johannesburg, you'll only hear, even if you told Johannesburg, about how good gold mining is, or how good gold mining was, and how it developed South Africa, the Johannesburg, to be at par with other cities in the world, like in New York, like in Paris, and they will say this is where the doyen, or where you can see how development, or how mining extraction or mineral extraction can bring development people, but you're not told about the horrors that people in Rivali, people in Meadowlands, people in Deep Roof live under. And I myself, this is one thing that had prompted me, that has prompted the organization that I work with, Earthlife Africa, to be taking up some of the issues. But unfortunately, because of the long process that has got to be followed, in other aspects we're not able to do. But what is important is that there is a renewed form of discussions, of following up and holding the institutions, particularly the city and the Department of Minerals and Resources, to account for being able to cast just an eye over what is happening and not take action to correct this. And I'm just wondering if this happens in the so-called African world-class city of Johannesburg, then what is happening in other African countries that don't have the same governance system, at least that is much better than we have in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Makoma, for talking about the government's role in perpetuating these harms, and also how some of these sites that have been impacted by the nuclear age, even if they're not being used today for that purpose, are still causing lasting harm to communities nearby. Okay, and for our last panelist, before we head into the Q&A session, is Mitchie Takeuchi. And just a reminder to folks, if you have questions for any of the panelists, feel free to drop them in the Q&A portion or the Q&A section, and we'll make sure that we'll share those amongst the prepared questions. But first, let me introduce Mitchie. Mitchie Takeuchi, a Hiroshima native, is a longtime New York City resident, entrepreneur, filmmaker, and activist. Her grandfather survived the atomic bombing in Hiroshima while he was the director of the Red Cross hospital there. Wanting to share what really happened under the mushroom cloud, Mitchie produced The Vow from Hiroshima, interweaving the life story of Hiroshima survivor Setsuko Thurlow, intergenerational activism, and the success of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which resulted in the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize and the TPNW entering into force in 2021, becoming international law. Over to you, Mitchie.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Jasmine. I'm so honored to be a part of this panel and also to be invited by Physicians for Social Responsibilities. I remember feeling so moved when I saw the big banners of PSR on various protests. I grew up in Hiroshima before I came to the United States, and since, as Jasmine said, I've been living in New York City for a long, long time. I'm a woman, and I am a person of color. First, my family background. As Jasmine said, my grandfather and my mother survived the atomic bombing in 1945. I watched the film Oppenheimer 3 times so far. The film made me think about what I had not paid much attention to, which is the long-term consequences of war. My grandfather, Dr. Ken Takeuchi, a military surgeon general, was transferred from Tokyo to Hiroshima to set up the new Red Cross hospital there in 1937, the largest hospital facility in that region of Japan. When the atomic bomb was detonated, he was a director and he was working, and that hospital was located in the center part of Hiroshima. When the bomb exploded, he was thrown by the blast and found himself critically injured with multiple broken bones all over his body and was not able to move. And yet he gave directives from a hospital gurney to the few surviving doctors and nurses who were struggling to treat the hundreds of injured, sick, and dying people who were streaming into the hospital without much medical supplies. I think of him and his team as the first responders of the first use of nuclear weapons. The entire city and its population suffered catastrophic destruction by the blast and the resulting fires. On August 9th, a plutonium bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and August 15, Japan surrendered. Over 200,000 people were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the end of the year, and countless more people were suffering from their wounds, burns, and radiation sickness. At the end of August, General Thomas Farrell of the Allied Forces, who was Leslie Grove's top aide for Manhattan Project, landed in Japan, and he was flown to Hiroshima and Nagasaki with a research and medical team from the United States to evaluate the damages of the cities. September 6, exactly 1 month after the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, General Farrell made the first public announcement to the foreign press. This is so upsetting and makes me very angry. He announced saying that there were no more atomic bomb sufferers from the use of the nuclear weapons because everyone who were injured and got sick all had died, including those who were sick because of radiation. Obviously, this was a complete distortion of what had happened under the mushroom cloud. Well, the United States won the war and Japan was defeated nation. This radically false assessment of those cities and their populations was announced publicly and loudly by the occupying force. And as we know, history is always written, or shall I say, rewritten by the winners. Shortly after the announcement, a press code was imposed in Japan. During the American occupation from 1945 to 1952, 7 years, the Japanese press was censored by the GHQ, General Headquarters. That meant any criticism of the American occupation was not allowed, while criticism of Japan during and before the war was repeatedly reported. The details of the atomic bombings, including the damage and the state of the victims, was not disclosed to anyone, anywhere, including the people of Japan. This press code naturally silenced Japanese voices and accounts of their horrific experiences. And during this time, the Allied forces taught American democracy for Japanese people. Following year in 1946, President Harry Truman ordered the formation of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, namely ABCC, and the National Research Council called together a group of scientists who agreed that a detailed and long-range study of the biological and medical effects upon the human being was one of the utmost important to the United States and mankind in general. The ABCC has had a controversial history and it still exists today as RERF, Radiation Effects Research Foundation, with Japanese scientists as collaborators now. Today, I want to share one voice of the Hibakusha who was forced to participate in the research project. The woman I spoke to this woman. She said, I was only an infant when the bomb was dropped. I was at the epicenter, and only my mother throwing herself on top of me allowed me to survive. When I reached first grade, I was called in by the ABCC and examined. After that, it was an annual examination. I was sent home with delicious American food, and I went because of that food. Several years later, for my annual examination, I was told to strip down to my panties and brought into a huge room. I had to stand in front of many doctors, all men, almost completely naked, and they were evaluating my growth level and discussing things in an unfamiliar language. I was going into puberty then. I felt so ashamed and humiliated that after that, I never wanted to have any association with being from Hiroshima. I begged my parents to send me to a school in Tokyo where such an examination would not happen. And for many years, I even refused to be identified as a Hibakusha. The ABCC solicited medical records of all the Hibakusha patients, and the information was confiscated from the local doctors. That medical information was never returned to the local doctors who were treating the Hibakusha. Let me be clear. The survivors believed that by subjecting themselves to those ongoing examinations, that in return, they would be given information about their health and what they could expect in the future regarding cancer and any other illnesses. They were living in the fear. However, they never received any reports, and they were never offered any treatment. For the 7 years of the occupation, the Hibakusha kept this forced silence. This silence stood for defeat, remorse, humiliation, shame, and anger, but they also persevered to rebuild their lives. I have heard many times from people who suffered the horror of the bombs, feeling that they were guinea pigs twice. First, when the US dropped the bombs on them, and second, when the ABCC studied them under a microscope for symptoms of the unknown effects of radiation. This is a part of the story that the film Oppenheimer did not tell, and this has deserved to be told. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchie, for sharing those stories. And you're right, they do deserve to be told. So as we bring in each of the panelists for a Q&A portion, I just want to alert folks that there's a link in the chat to visit the site to learn more about Mitchie's documentary, The Vow from Hiroshima. So feel free to explore that in your free time to learn more about that wonderful documentary and all the work that Mitchie's doing. Okay. Just one more second as we get Makoma and Alicia up here. Perfect. Perfect. All right. Now we have everyone. Okay, I wanted to start off with a question for everyone. So whoever wants to answer it, feel free to begin. But how have you witnessed governments or leaders pushing particular narratives to evade accountability for the harms caused by the legacy of uranium throughout the nuclear enterprise? So whether that's mining, milling, production, development, testing, use, etc. Don't be shy. I know, Alicia, you have done a lot of work in regards to the Los Alamos National Laboratory and the ways that that laboratory and its existence on the land has greatly impacted not only the land in New Mexico, but the way that New Mexicans live and the ways that their lives have kind of been intertwined with this lab. So I was wondering if you could expand more upon that.
Sure. And, I think there is a persistent narrative with Los Alamos National Laboratory that the work there is safe. And, there have been examples in recent memory and then in the deeper past that show that that work, causes harm in certain ways, maybe not all the time, but it certainly does. And so the narrative that it's safe, it can be challenged on multiple different fronts. And so I think that's really important. But there is a kind of heroic narrative around the Manhattan Project. If you go to Los Alamos and you spend any time there, there's statues of Oppenheimer with General Leslie Groves. There's streets, named Trinity, Oppenheimer, Bikini Atoll, after the Pacific Islands, that were used for nuclear testing. And so there is this kind of national narrative there that the weapon that we created in Los Alamos ended the World War, and that it was necessary. So that narrative continues, I think, into the present. And just to give some people some context, the US is embarking on an expansion of its nuclear weapons stockpile. So we are in the midst of a modernization plan currently, and that's costing billions and billions of dollars. And the narrative that goes along with that is that our stockpile that we currently have is maybe aging. The jury's still out on whether it's actually aging, but the Congress has basically said, well, let's just start modernizing anyway, in the event that it might actually be aging. And so this has created what has been described to me as the New Manhattan Project by upper level folks at Los Alamos National Laboratory. And so you kind of have this combination of this historic moment with this moment now. And I think what that's done is shown, it's created this new narrative that we need more nuclear weapons right now. And so Los Alamos is currently slated to produce 30 plutonium pits per year by 2030. There's another site called Savannah River site that's slated to produce 50 plutonium pits per year. They're running late, so they will likely not produce those pits until 2036 or 2040. The goal is to be able to have 80 pits per year combined. And so, I think that one story that I will be working on in the future is our stockpile aging? If the jury's still out, then we don't know if it's still aging. But what I've been told by experts is that this is a problem for the future, that we don't need to be making nuclear weapons right now, that we don't have to really think about this until 40 years from now. And so the urgency around creating nuclear weapons today, I think, is, part of this language of militarization that we're seeing, and the US saying, well, we're responding to Russia, and we're responding to China, and we're responding to North Korea, when in fact, it could be that everybody is responding to the US, which is what I've been told by sources. And so instead of having a bipolar Cold War, which is what we had with the Soviet Union, we have a lot of different, powers that have nuclear weapons, and everybody is kind of escalating. And so when the US says we're going to start ramping up our capability, then that also elevates on the global stage. And so I think there's a lot of narratives that we have to contend with and really think critically about. And so in northern New Mexico, when that expansion started to be able to build 30 plutonium pits per year, the impact on local communities is that, you know, we have a major expansion that requires a lot of construction, and it also requires training people to be able to do some really difficult work. And so that includes handling fissionable material in glove boxes, that includes handling nuclear waste, that includes measuring radioactivity as a radiation control technician. And so the labs have embarked, Los Alamos National Labs, and through Congress have embarked on training, you know, people in New Mexico how to do that. And largely they have targeted poor communities of color to do that work. And so I think that's, you know, when you go from global to local, you can see when we expand our weapons complex, you know, on the global scale, everybody feels like they have to respond, but on the hyper local scale, that means that yes, there will be jobs available, but those jobs will very likely be some of the most harmful positions in the weapons complex. So that I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for all of that information. That was really insightful and obviously awful to hear, but thank you. I wanted to ask Makoma, your formative years were spent in Soweto, South Africa, where student protests heavily influenced the global campaign to end apartheid. How did that experience influence your work as a social environmental justice advocate working to implement a just transition to clean energy in South Africa?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. And what I can say is that living in Soweto, born in Soweto, living in Soweto even up until now, at that time when the student uprisings took place, I was very young. I think I was around 10 or so. And what I experienced, I observed, and when I went to high school, that is when I got conscientized. But one thing that struck me as I understood much better the power that the student had and the courage that they had. My work is influenced by the courage that I learned from the students. One is that they have taught us, they have taught me that if you see an injustice, don't just keep quiet and see it and say, it's not my duty to correct what is wrong. And the absence of fear that anything is possible, I got it from them and interacting with some of them at a later stage. And some of the stuff that I think if all of us, but I'm glad that in this panel, it seems like it's a panel of courageous women. And courageous women, this month in South Africa, we celebrating Women's Month. This is where we reflect as women. This is where we recommit ourselves, because it was women in 1956, which was something unheard of, confronting the apartheid regime to say, do away with your discriminatory laws. And this is what is being celebrated this month. But I also saw a question on the chat around South Africa's nuclear weapons. Officially, this is what actually came about prior 1994, that South Africa relinquished its nuclear weapons. And the nuclear weapons were linked to South Africa's position by then, because South Africa was surrounded by states or by countries that were against apartheid, and South Africa needed, the apartheid South Africa needed some form of how they protected themselves. And that's how they built a nuclear power station, the only one in Africa, Quebec, as a guise to say we're having a nuclear power station. But when they know that they are manufacturing nuclear weapons, so it was some sort of a guise of that. And the famous president, and Nelson Mandela made that announcement that South Africa is relinquishing. And he was like, say, I don't have the exact words, but it sounded like never, ever will South Africa use nuclear weapons. And I think this was when he made a speech at the United Nations Security Council, where he spoke against this terrible and terrifying weapons of mass destruction. So in my knowledge, and officially, this is what South Africa says, that we don't have any nuclear weapons, but we know that Quebec was built as a disguise for manufacturing nuclear weapons. And we have Pelindaba, where nuclear medicine is being also manufactured. And that was where there was Safari One, and these were some of the guys that the apartheid regime used. And for now, I mean, South Africa, it says it's denuclearized, as we say, doesn't have nuclear weapons. But this is something that we cannot confirm, because if you need this information, the weapons may be stockpiled somewhere, but South Africa has committed itself to a number of international conventions around a lot of issues. And I think they have also committed themselves in international conventions against nuclear weapons and against any use of harmful nuclear technologies. But we do have a nuclear power station. So what drives us, what drives people like me as activists, is that we wouldn't want to see what Tata Mandela had described as terrible and terrifying weapons of mass destructions going on. And that is why we are challenging that the Quebec nuclear power station be closed, because for now there's a proposal to expand it. And that is why we are continuously talking to other activists and people's organizations around Africa to come together so that we can share experiences, we can share tools, we can share learnings on how to challenge the proposed nuclear power stations, and also how to call for the closing and rehabilitation of the areas where, or the places where uranium mining has been taking place. Thank you.
Thank you. And speaking of women and the role of women in this work, Mitchie, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the gendered impacts of radiation exposure that you've experienced in Japan, in terms of the physical and psychological health, as well as the societal pressures. How have those manifested for female Hibakusha over time?
Well, thank you for the question. I can just only talk about my mother's generation. She was about 19 years old when the atomic bomb was dropped. And he actually went into the Red Cross Hospital on August 9th, into the center of the city looking for her father, where she found her father being seriously ill. Thus, she stayed there, taking care of him for like a couple of weeks, few weeks. Then she was obviously subject to the radiation impact, right? And radiation impact. And this is amazing thing, because her father, the scientist, the doctor, said to her at some point that he told her that don't say anything about the fact that she was in the Red Cross hospital right after the atomic bombing. So she kept the promise and she kept the silence. The background is that because of the impact of radiation, particularly for female, particularly for the young women, it was very, very concerned, because Japan has this traditional tradition for arranged marriage. It's not as bad as it really sounds, arranged marriage, because it's consent by everyone. However, because of that, having this fear or impact of radiation, that would really affect marriageability of the young people. So women had to keep the silence. And then I spoke to all my classmates and in Hiroshima, and all of my friends said that their mothers, well, of course, fathers too, but their mothers did not want to talk about anything because they were concerned about their kids' daughters' marriageability, which is ours. So I don't know if I'm answering to your question, but the radiation impact, particularly on women, has made huge, not just biological, but very psychological pressure on women.
No, thank you for sharing that, because I feel like we do hear a lot about the biological impacts of radiation exposure on women or the female body. And I don't think we hear enough about how radiation exposure has more impacts beyond that in terms of the psychological and the social impacts. And I'm sure that is replicated in other communities as well that have been harmed. Like I think the Marshall Islands, there's been similar issues of the women facing more adverse societal and psychological impacts as a result of exposure than their male counterparts. There's been a question this has been brought up by Makoma and maybe Shampa as well, but there have been a few questions in the chat about the linkages between nuclear weapons and nuclear energy, and specifically this idea that nuclear energy is clean energy and is something that we must invest in order to combat the climate crisis. So this is a general question for all of the panelists. Is nuclear energy actually a safe and viable clean energy alternative, especially for those who live near and work in the industries that produce nuclear materials, operate nuclear facilities, or store nuclear waste?
Yeah, I would say that one always gets confronted with that question. And because this is a narrative that is being pushed through, and we know that even the European Union had discussions around this, and this is still a contentious issue. But however, I think from where we are, nuclear, it's not clean energy. Nuclear, it's the kind of fossil fuel. I mean, start from uranium mining and you go to all the processes that one has got to go through to produce the end product. It's carbon. That process is really carbon intensive, and you cannot say it's clean energy. And what we always are told about is that nothing comes out of the chimneys. But if nothing comes out of the chimneys, the process towards having a nuclear reactor, it's actually not clean at all. It's carbon intensive. And the worst part, it's about the waste. How do we deal with the waste? Because this waste remains radioactive for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And how do we declare it that it's clean? Carbon budget of any nuclear reactor, it's actually very high, and we should not be fooled that nuclear is a solution for climate change. It cannot. And if it is a solution for climate change, how intensive is uranium mining? How intensive it's using concrete to build reactors? So just those two processes tells you that it cannot be clean, it's carbon intensive, and we should not fall into that narrative that nuclear power, it's clean. It's quite expensive. The externalized cost of nuclear remain for 100 and 100 and 100 of years. Thank you.
So I'm just going to piggyback on those comments and completely agree with them. So right from the start of the nuclear era, there was this distinction that was made between good nuclear power and bad nuclear power, right? So good nuclear power is nuclear energy that leads to development, and bad nuclear power are weapons. And it's a false distinction. We know this, right? It's the same process that leads to both. You go a step further with weapons, but it is the same process. So if you look at the entire production chain, as we should, as I think all of us have argued here, we should, there is nothing clean about nuclear energy, right? Right from uranium mining all the way to the storage of nuclear waste. We still haven't figured out what to do with the nuclear waste we already have, right? In huge amounts, right? And we are going to produce more to, yeah. So I think sort of nuclear energy has become the sort of magic fix to the climate crisis. The climate crisis is real. We need to deal with it, but there's no magic bullet that's going to deal with it, and certainly not a technology that I think is quite dirty. Actually, it's the opposite of clean.
Can I add to that? So there's something, when I think about New Mexico being a nuclear colony, there is this issue of storing waste here, and not just waste from weapons production, but now there is an effort on behalf of industry to store spent nuclear fuel in New Mexico. And this gets to where other speakers left off, is where do we put the waste? And so this company called Holtec wants to put much of the nation's spent nuclear fuel into this repository in southern New Mexico. And the thing about it is that, the state has passed a law, Senate Bill 53, which prohibits the storage of spent nuclear fuel in the state. And so even though we've created that law, the facility has still been licensed by the federal government. So this has become, at least in New Mexico, a states' rights issue about how they consent or don't consent to something that's being kind of forced. And so the waste question, I think, is really big. Of course, mining is really big here in New Mexico too, because we have uranium mining. But the other thing that, people don't necessarily consider is that waste doesn't just teleport into waste sites. And so, for example, if you want to store waste in New Mexico, then you have to send it by rail line to New Mexico. And, they want to kind of create a system by which nobody knows which rail line will be used to send that waste over to New Mexico just for protection. And so, but we know that our rail lines pass through urban communities and through rural communities. And so we know that the waste has to travel through all of those communities to arrive in one place. And so that's the other kind of big question here, is that when you have waste coming from all over the nation to one place, then it is necessarily going to crisscross the entire state. And so that is our kind of the issue that we're contending with currently.
Thank you so much for that. This is definitely an issue that many communities are dealing with. And there was a question in the chat from Joseph Bergson. Specifically, tomorrow, Japan is beginning to release water used to cool melted down reactors at Fukushima. I believe they're releasing that into the ocean. How can we assess the potential harm to the environment? And is there anything that we can do about it?
Obviously, there is potential harm to the environment, particularly to the ecological balance of the sea. And this, I think when Fukushima happened, there were reports of how fishes were dying, or they were coming out of the sea because of the radioactivity, that the ecological balance in that particular area had been changed. And so the waters changed, and so life in the sea could not survive. And I'm just wondering, what more harm is this going to cause? Has there been any of the research made, or just to check as to what may possibly happen? Because of, I believe that water would be really very highly radioactive. And pouring that water in the sea I'm not just wondering what would happen with life, but also on the beaches around where the water would be, the waves would be flowing into. Thanks.
I like to add something. So I watch Japanese news from Japan, NHK, every day, and then they really are broadcasting, telling the news about this release date, which is the 24th. And the government is really reassuring that they have met the standard of safety, so to speak. And they are trying to, how do you call it? Trying to convince the fishermen's communities that this is going to be okay. I think that in order to make any difference, it has to be the movements and protests from outside of Japan. Because the voices within Japan is never going to be heard by the establishment, like current government. And I think that the voices, strong voices against Japan, particularly Japan really hates to have a bad reputation in general. If we could really make some kind of a PR campaign or something to put them in a bad rap, that might be one good way to do it. And I think it requires a lot of creative campaign to make influence for Japanese leaders. It's not very specific, but I think it has to come from outside of Japan to make a change, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's definitely going to take all of us, I think, to make any change on these issues, unfortunately, because so often our government leaders are more concerned with making sure that those who fund their campaigns and help maintain their power, that their needs are met versus the people. I wanted to kind of switch over to another thread. You all do such unique work in relations to nuclear abolition, and something that I think has been touched on and that I'm always hearing about as a fellow young person is, how can we engage more young people on this issue, on this topic? How can we get them more engaged and mobilized on nuclear abolition? And Shampa, you teach students, and you specifically are working on a new curriculum that kind of decolonizes nuclear studies. So when teaching students about nuclear weapons and nuclear policy, what narratives have you found to be most engaging with your students, and how do these narratives maybe contrast to the mainstream narratives that the public are being fed, whether that's from the government, mainstream media, pop culture, things like that? And have you faced any challenges or opposition in your efforts to decolonize this information?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, I think young people are mostly not thinking about nuclear weapons, right? So I'm going to start teaching a new class next week, and one of the first questions on international politics, and one of the first questions I'll ask my students is, what are the most pressing issues, or what are the things that keep you up at night? And I can assure you, nuclear weapons are not going to be one of those things. In an interview, Christopher Nolan actually said that when he told his kids that he was making this film on Oppenheimer, one of his children said, "Why are you making a film on nuclear weapons? Nobody cares about nuclear weapons." And that's what sort of was in part what sort of affirmed for him that he needed to make a movie on nuclear weapons, because young people are not thinking about it. So I will say, and there was a question about this, I think, in the Q&A as well, about what opportunities the film opens up. I think despite its inadequacies, I think there are some things the film actually does do well, right? But even without that, I think the film does give us an opportunity to open up conversations that were not happening for a long time, right? Since the sort of anti-nuclear movements died down in the post-Cold War world, there has not been a lot of conversation about nuclear weapons, even though we live with the existential danger of nuclear weapons. So I'm glad the film offers that opportunity to sort of reignite some of these conversations we absolutely need to have with our students, with our communities, with folks more broadly. And so when I ask my students, what are the issues that really animate them? Climate change is the first one usually, and that makes sense. It's their future at stake, right? They will talk about race more and more, especially since the George Floyd murders. And I'm glad they do. And they are thinking about war. They are thinking about their economic futures, as they should, right? It's not nuclear weapons. But all those connections are connected, all those issues are connected to nuclear weapons. So the way that I reach out to them is by showing them how closely connected those are. And if you really actually look at the writings of early sort of activists, people of color activists, folks who were thinking about colonialism and anti-racism early on, they were making those connections between anti-colonialism and disarmament. Right from the 1955 Bandung Conference, where leaders of third world countries gathered, they were thinking about both decolonization and nuclear disarmament together. Martin Luther King Jr. did, right? There were leaders in the Black Panther movement who did. So race has always been connected to sort of nuclear disarmament to nuclear abolition. And part of what I do is remind them of that history as a way of engaging them, right? Climate change is very much connected to nuclear weapons. That is very obvious to those who have lived in places that have been the sites of nuclear testing. So in the Pacific, for instance, right, people don't connect environmental issues with nuclear weapons sort of naturally, because the environmental issues they live with are in part a product of the legacy of nuclear weapons testing, right? So those are connected. The fact that we are spending so much on nuclear weapons, and ICANN has been doing some really great work on generating figures on how much nuclear weapons states are spending per year, per month, per minute on nuclear weapons, right? We are creating weapons of genocide that take resources away from the kinds of things my students do care about, right? Which is solving hunger, which is sort of an economically secure future. So for me, the way that I get them to care about nuclear weapons, and I think the Oppenheimer film is going to again create an opening to be able to have those conversations, is by connecting decolonization, connecting feminism, connecting environmental thinking, connecting anti-racism with nuclear weapons. I think that's what gets them. And I think, I don't buy the narrative that young people are, distracted, entitled, apathetic. My students they're intellectually curious. They've been through a lot, and they're facing a very bleak future. And yet they come to my classes with a lot of energy, asking good questions. They're courageous. I think Makoma talked about this. They have, so I think we need to engage young people more and more. All of us need to do this. And we are doing it not just in classrooms, but in all the kind of work that my fellow panelists are doing as well.
Yeah, and on that, as kind of our final question for everyone, as organizers and activists, a lot of us on this call are in those positions. We're always trying to figure out ways to keep the work going by engaging the youth on nuclear abolition. And for each of you, what narratives or strategies have you found to be most effective? So I know, Shampa, you mentioned, connecting nuclear weapons to a lot more proximate security concerns for young people. Is it focusing on race? Is it focusing on the ways that these weapons connect to these broader systems of injustice? Just curious for each of you, what have you found to be the most beneficial in your work to get audiences to care about nuclear abolition, especially younger audiences? And how can we, the audience, help uplift your narratives and your work outside of this webinar?
Okay, let me start. I think we find ourselves in different contexts, and also we living in a different era. And the context, most of the time, it's what really dictates or that really brings up about what would work best at a particular place and time. I must say it has been, let me say in my context in South Africa, after 1994, because of all the declarations, because of all the beautiful statements, and that people believed that this is not gonna go on, or this is, I mean, when in 1994 it said never ever nuclear weapons, and we should like denuclearize, but that still continued. And today we find that there's more of proposals to extend the lifespan of the only nuclear power station in Africa. So as an activist, what has worked very well for us, or at least in my context, is that we use storytelling, but it's an intergenerational conversations that we have. And it's a slow process, but then what we normally do, we get people who are coming from different generations. For an example, there may be someone who was born before or when the world wars took place, was like a teenager. We get that kind of person to tell the stories of around that time. What really happened? What were their fears? And what is that they're looking for? And what do they yearn the future to be like? We also use the stories as part of what we'd call ancient wisdoms that the young people would learn from the older generation. That is working very well. But however, one thing that we always encourage young people also to do is to find information on the net. And finding information on the net with the context that where we are used to traditional people's organizations, mass movements. And that is like going down because young people are now more into social media. So social media is being used to conscientize, to bring up issues, to link issues. Like, for an example, we have been challenging young people to say, why do you have to go buy new clothes? Why don't you check where the clothes were made, where the techies were made? I mean, that goes with around the carbon budget adjustment mechanisms, so that they understand that the carbon footprint is much higher, and they also check a lot of stuff. Around Cape Town, as part of the storytelling, I would always sometimes within a group of friends or within like the closed social media networks that one is part of, and just post that I'm going to Cape Town. I'm not sure if I'm going to come back alive because of the nuclear power station. Anything can happen there. And this also helps for other people to ask, what do you mean you don't show you're not coming back? But I know this is the strategy that I use to create consciousness into people to say, I'm going to this. Then you start talking about what exactly is happening around the nuclear power station and what are the fears are, and also bring about issues about issues, regulations, bring issues about international treaties, bring issues around international conventions, that this is what we have and why they are not followed. And so that means the city of Cape Town is at risk. I'm not saying people should not visit the beautiful city of Cape Town, but I'm just warning that when people go to Cape Town, they must think about it, because there's been also been many cracks on the reactors, and the French government or the French company is holding the South African government or ESCOM to ransom whenever they have to fix those cracks. And they're actually the ones that are also pushing for the life expansion of the plant. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, storytelling is such a crucial part of this work as well. So thank you for bringing that up. I don't know if Alicia and Mitchie, if you had any other comments before we wrap up.
Yes, I'd like to, oh, sorry. Oh, okay. And that's like to say something, the response of the film, The Vow from Hiroshima, has been so inspiring to me. And then especially when we show it to diverse age group from 15-year-old to 95-year-old. And I think the young people, whenever they watch this film, they come up to me and said, what can I do? How can I get involved? And I think I thought about this, what that was. I think it was the inspiration. Our story, of course, states the difficulty of atomic bomb and difficulty that Miss Setsuko Soro went through and so forth and so on. But the film has a very inspiring element. And I really feel young people are very attracted to the inspiration, and that really motivates. So I think we always need to include that hopeful aspect of the narrative.
I was just going to add something, as a journalist, I'm not in the position to be an advocate or an activist. Really, I see my role as building a critical consciousness and providing access to information so that people can be really informed on issues in a very complex way. And so what's important about that role for me is that I'm one of the few journalists of color writing from an impacted community. And that is, I think, significant to point out because when I write, I am looking for sources who are coming from impacted communities as well. And for me, those people are experts of their own experience. And so that already generates interest, I think, among the community and creates investment among the community in what, hopefully in building that consciousness, in building that critical consciousness. And it goes along with a broader philosophy that I have about self-representation. And so for so long, our communities in New Mexico have been represented by dominant narratives and mainstream narratives that don't necessarily speak about those who are most impacted on any number of issues, including nuclear weapons. And so when I have been given the position to speak about nuclear history from the perspective of an impacted community, I think there is more willingness within the impacted community to say, hey, there's actually somebody here who's listening to our stories. And that's really important for me. And so I spend a lot of time traveling to places throughout New Mexico, throughout the Southwest, listening to other people's stories. And so it gets back to storytelling and to oral histories. And I think that's really, really important because, in a dominant mainstream media kind of narrative, our oral histories have never been valued. And I think it's really important to value our histories and talk about, the Native and Hispanic women who changed the diapers and cooked the food and cleaned the houses of Manhattan Project workers, to, the people that have cleaned up the waste, the pride also that people have had in working at Los Alamos National Laboratory. People have found, have been dignified by that work too. And I can't dismiss that either. Because it has provided some, modicum of economic status. And so my job is to weave all of those complex narratives together to reflect something meaningful back to the community. And I think that hopefully can relate across the spectrum to young people, to our elders in our community, something that speaks to their experience. And so that's just how I see my role.
Thank you so much. This was such a lovely conversation, and I wish we had like 3 more hours to go further into some of these topics. But alas, we have hit the end of our event. Thank you so much for our panelists for joining us, for sharing your stories, and for allowing us to learn from your expertise and your perspectives. And thank you so much to the audience for attending today and being here, because that is a huge first step in doing this work and uplifting the stories and the perspectives and the experiences of communities of color who are disproportionately harmed by nuclear weapons. So thank you so much. And You will receive a link to the recording of the webinar after this is over, just in case anyone wants to rewatch, or if folks weren't able to come, they'll be able to take a look back and watch. But again, thank you so much for coming. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day. And with that, adios.